Now to our program guest, who's the Immigration Minister, Scott Morrison. He was the subject of a blistering attack by the shadow Immigration Minister, Richard Marles, yesterday over the government's decision to finally send those 157 Tamil asylum seekers to Nauru.
The only reason they have been put through this wretched roller coaster has been to protect Scott Morrison's personal political scoreboard. We've got a cowboy in charge who is treating people with contempt, causing misery along the way and taking the Australian public for mugs. This is a minister who has lost control of his portfolio.
Scott Morrison, thanks very much for joining us on Insiders.
Hi, Fran.
Minister, why did you send those 157 people to Nauru in those late-night flights without first letting their lawyers know that they were being sent to Nauru and without letting all the people who wanted to have access to their lawyers first?
Well, a couple of things. First, Fran, anyone who's arrived illegally by boat is subject to offshore processing, and they are taken to one of those places, whether it's Nauru or Manus Island, and these people were all in that category. They had the opportunity to speak to Indian consular officials while they were in Curtin. The offer was made to do that, and that's why they were brought to Curtin. And when we were told that they didn't wish to do that, those offers were not going to be taken up, then the policy kicks in. Now, it's not true to say that there was no access to lawyers. I think it was on the 29th of July, the leaders of that group, who were the appointed plaintiffs in that case, had access to their lawyers, and there was a discussion. We're not privy to what those discussions were, and following those discussions, 157 people coincidentally decided not to take up that offer. Now,
well, I've spoken to the lawyers of these people. They're perplexed. They say quite categorically they never told people not to speak with the Indian consular officials. There was 9 refugee lawyers preparing to fly to Curtin on Monday to talk to all these people. All apparently sought to have representation. Your department knew about that. Why, with that all set up, whisk them off to Nauru? Why not let that happen?
Because they weren't seeking to speak to Indian consular officials. That's why they were in Curtin. And once they decided that that wasn't an offer they wanted to take up, well, they were subject to offshore processing. And Fran, I'd made that clear, and the department had made that clear from the moment of their arrival. I even said it on 7:30 earlier this week, where I made it very clear that if people didn't want to talk to Indian consular officials and to look at having the opportunity to return to India, which was, I think, a very good arrangement that we're able to come to with the government of India. It wasn't a usual arrangement. I'm disappointed that that wasn't able to be pursued, but once that was no longer possible, well, they were off to Nauru.
And could you just clarify this? How did the asylum seekers let the immigration officials know they weren't prepared to speak to the Indian lawyers, because the Indian consular officials? Because the lawyers for these people were surprised at that. In fact, they'd written to the government a week ago, and I'm quoting this letter: "We would hope to engage in a cooperative approach concerning interviews. We do not foreclose the possibility that some of the persons on the vessel may satisfy any criteria the High Commissioner of India wishes to put forward and might be prepared to consider a return to India." The lawyers are on the record saying their advice, most likely to some of these clients, would be take the Indian offer. So what did the clients tell the government?
Well, I'm advised that the government, I'm advised by my officials that they chose not to take up the offer. Now, that's why they were in Curtin. Now, I understand other lawyers wanted to engage with other lawyers for Indian consular officials and engage in a fairly protracted process. But my advice is that they had chosen not to take up the offer. They hadn't exercised that option. And when that occurs, then people go to offshore processing, Fran.
But the consular officials weren't there in Curtin yet, were they? So they would have had to wait for those people to arrive.
No, they were offered the opportunity to speak to Indian consular officials, and no one elected to take up that offer, I'm advised. So that means that offshore processing then applies, and that was always the policy. There were only ever 2 options here, Fran, that they would either return to India or that they would go to Nauru. And what I've noticed with this incident, first of all, people said they didn't want them to go back to Sri Lanka. It was never the government's intention at any time for them to go back to Sri Lanka. Then they said they didn't want to be sent back to India. Now they're saying they didn't want to be sent to Nauru. The constant theme here, Fran, is they wanted to come to Australia. That option was never, ever on the table.
Do you think their lawyers advised them not to speak to the Indian consular officials?
Well, I don't know, Fran. I wasn't in that discussion.
How many people did you hope India might take back?
Well, again, that would have been subject to any discussion with those officials. But what we do know...
But you've been in long talks with them. You must have had a sense.
What we do know is there are around 2/3 of those, slightly over that, who are on that vessel, who we know hadn't just transited out of Sri Lanka into India onto that voyage. And they'd been resident in refugee camps, those camps that are set up in Tamil Nadu and in other villages across Tamil Nadu. And they had been at schools, they had been engaged living there with family. We had teenagers who were on that ship who were born in India.
The upshot of all of this is the Australian government picked up these people on a boat about 30 nautical miles off Christmas Island, held them for a month on a customs ship, I understand most of the time not far outside India's migration zone, then took them thousands of miles on the ship back to Cocos Island, now finally to Nauru. Why didn't the government take these people when they were close to Christmas Island, process them on Christmas Island and send them to Nauru? It would have been a much shorter circuited process.
Because that's not our policy, Fran.
Well, it is your policy to send people to...
Fran, it is not our policy as a first instance to do exactly what you've just said. It is our first response to seek to get people back to where they've departed from. That's our policy. That's what we do first, and that's what we work through a methodical process, working through a series of options. We sought to do that cooperatively with the Government of India in a partnership. We went there, we spoke to them, we worked those issues through, and we came up with the option that saw them return to Curtin, where the opportunity for those people who had been resident in India, they may have been able to return to India, and that includes up to around about 50 children. That's what we were working towards, Fran. Now, that wasn't possible, that offer wasn't taken up, and when that fails, you go to offshore processing. Offshore processing is a backstop measure. It is not the sum entirety of our border protection regime, and that is why our border protection regime has been so effective and is saving lives.
Indeed, you've already made it clear that your first preference was to get these people back to India. It's been reported that one detainee on board the customs vessel told their lawyers they were being trained in operating the orange lifeboats. Can you confirm now that was the plan, to send people back to India on the lifeboats in the same way we've sent people back to Indonesia on these orange lifeboats?
Well, I'll give you the same response I gave Sarah Ferguson, and that is I don't engage in discussion of those sort of operational matters. You're very aware of our policy on that, Fran, and that shouldn't come as any surprise.
Well, let's assume that you did do that, because we understand
well,
they were
you
in
can't
striking...
assume that, Fran.
Well, we know you've sent people back to Indonesia on orange lifeboats. We can presume you tried or considered the same policy with India, I guess. Why didn't you just send them back on the orange lifeboats in the same way you have done it to Indonesia?
Well, I'll give you the same response, Fran, and that is we don't discuss those sort of level of operational details, but our undertaking here and what we sought to do was work with the Government of India. And that's what we did, and we had the discussion. It was our preference that people would have been transferred back to India where these discussions could have taken place. That suggestion was not taken up by the Indian government, and therefore we worked to the next plan that we were able to agree to. Now, at the end of the day, that has resulted in everybody now going to Nauru, but it is always our preference that people go back, because we know when people go back, that's what ensures that people don't get on boats, and particularly children don't get on boats. Let's not forget, it was just over a year ago, in July of last year, 4,300 people turned up on 48 boats and 18 people died. That's not what happened this July.
Let's talk about the children. 50 of those you sent back to Nauru on Friday night are children. This comes in a week where we've heard very, very disturbing evidence from doctors about the level of care for children on Christmas Island and on places like Nauru, and the impact that has on children. Why, knowing that, why did you decide to send these kids to Nauru? Why didn't you at least decide to keep the children perhaps in community detention?
Because offshore processing is a universal policy, and when you create exceptions to that, Fran, then you create an incentive for children to get on boats. And I hope the days now are long gone where children are dying at sea, and my officials and officers who work for customs and the Navy officers have to scoop children out of the water as corpses.
That's very emotive language, but a lot of people would hope the day is long gone that we don't keep children in places where we have now empirical evidence stacking up that they are being caused severe mental stress. Here you are, the Minister, with a decision on hand, 50 children. You could have taken the decision to minimise harm and keep them in community detention. You took the other decision that you know was going to likely exacerbate the harm for these kids and send them to...
Well, Fran, what I've done since I've become Minister is we've put significant resources into Nauru. I mean, the accommodation is air-conditioned for young children in Nauru. There is a playing field we've put in. There is play equipment. There is shaded areas for learning. There is covered areas that are air-conditioned for the schooling. We have put considerable resources into Nauru to ensure that it's fit for families.
And still the evidence is this is bad for kids, isn't it?
Sorry?
Still the evidence is this is bad for kids. This situation is bad for kids.
Well, Fran, I don't want to see any children in detention, and since we came to government, we've reduced the number of children in detention, both offshore and onshore, by 35%. 450 children are less in detention than when I became the minister, and it's more than 60% less on Christmas Island. Now, we're trying to get children out of detention, but one of the reasons we've been able to achieve that so far, and there is a long way to go, is that every time a child gets out of detention, another child is now not turning up on a boat in the same way they were under the previous government. Now, I know Chris Bowen tried really hard on this, but the problem he had is every time he got someone out of detention, about 2 more boats turned up. Now, we're dealing with the boats coming, and I'm dealing with getting the children out of detention. I don't want to see children in detention, Fran. I have 2 children of my own, and I don't want to see children going into that environment. But the policy is necessary, together with all the other measures, to ensure that we don't have that outcome. We're improving the facilities, we're increasing the investment, all investments that weren't in place, planned, budgeted, or even contemplated under the previous government.
And yet children remain there, and the doctors who've been working on Christmas Island told a human rights inquiry this week the paediatric care on Christmas Island, which is a facility we own, we run, we operate, is basically non-existent. There is a lack of basic medical supplies. Some children have their medications taken away from them, putting them in dangerous medical situations. Why can't we do better than that?
Well, I think we have to do better all the time, friend, but what the status of this inquiry is at the moment is an inquiry. And what I'm going to do is
It's real evidence from real doctors.
I'm not disputing it. What I'm saying is that testimony will be provided, testimony will be tested, there will be a report that's conducted and produced, and I will look at that. And I've always said, now I've had the Red Cross, I've had others at these centres, Save the Children, and they've come to me in meetings that I've held with them, they've made good suggestions, and I've taken those suggestions up, and we've improved the conditions, not only on Nauru, but on Christmas Island as well. Remember, it was our government that got the children to school on Christmas Island. When I became minister, there was no funding for those children to go to school every single day. We put $2.4 million in to ensure those children can go to school, and they are going to school today as a result of the decision we took, and that recommendation came from my own advisory committee, which is led by Paris Aristotle, and we acted on that advice.
Minister, I understand this is a complex situation, but when we hear the evidence we heard this week from Dr Peter Young, the chief psychiatrist in charge of the mental health services on Christmas Island, that some children have, it's common method of self-harm for kids to bang their heads on walls at Christmas Island. Some have tried to hurt themselves swallowing detergent and other substances. How troubled are you by that? Doesn't that make you want to act immediately, not wait for the end of the inquiry?
I'm very troubled by it, but equally I already am acting, Fran, along the lines I've already mentioned to you in terms of the services and support and facilities that we're putting in, and also by ensuring that we're not getting children going into these facilities, and we're stopping them getting on boats in the first place, and I'm getting them out, Fran. There are 450 less children in detention today than when I became minister. Now, the job is not done. I still have 550-odd children who are in mainland detention, and it is my job to get them all out as soon as I possibly can. Now, that's what I'm working to, Fran. Now, these inquiries are raising a whole range of questions, and there's a whole bunch of testimony that is being provided. Now, that has to be tested against the broader context of what's occurring, and what I want to know is what the facts are, and when I have the full facts, then I can take further action to the action I've already taken.
In pursuit of those facts, more evidence in this inquiry from Peter Young that your department tried to get him to take some statistics out of a report which was showing a high level of mental stress amongst children on Christmas Island. Have you investigated that claim?
Yeah, I've spoken to the Secretary about that, and the Secretary has already written back to the Commissioner and outlined what is actually occurring. I mean, in these meetings, there is always 2 sets of versions of what has occurred. What they're working through is a process to get the best possible reporting of mental health in these facilities. The Chief Medical Officer and the Independent Health Advisor to the Secretary are working with IHMS and are bringing in other experts to ensure that we get the best measure of reporting on mental health. Now,
what does that mean, that Peter Young wasn't told to take those statistics out?
Well, what I'm saying is that there's a process that is underway. That process is not completed. There was testimony that was given, but I think it's important, Fran, with this inquiry, that we don't leap ahead and make a whole bunch of conclusions until that inquiry has been able to go through all its evidence, and that evidence can be properly tested, and the department has the opportunity to respond to what has been put at that inquiry, and that's what the Secretary has done, and I'm waiting for the outcome of that process. Now, I want the facts. When I became Minister, I insisted on every week I get a dashboard of what is occurring right across the detention network, what's going across the broader immigration space, because this information helps me make decisions. And that information has to be good, and I think the department has done a good job in getting that information to me, but I know they're always trying to improve it.
Minister, a couple of other issues just briefly. What's the latest with arrangements with PNG and Manus Island? Because the original deal signed by Labor a year ago was that it would last for a year. That deadline's gone. Do we still have a deal in place with Manus Island?
Well, it was extended till the end of this year, and I see no reason, and there are no signs that there'll be any changes to those arrangements, and they will continue. We have over 200 people now who have had recommendations or decisions in relation to their refugee status. We've had people resettled on Nauru successfully, and that process, it can always go faster, and I wish it would, but at the same time, I think we're all making good progress on that front. But the progress I'm most happy with, Fran, is that there has only been now one venture compared to the more than 200 that sought to come over the same period of time of over 7 months last year.
And Minister, on another matter entirely, as Immigration Minister, are you concerned about the situation of baby Gammy, the serious ill baby of the Australian couple, the surrogate baby who's left in Thailand? The Prime Minister said yesterday, we'll see what might be possible. Do you believe the biological parents of Gammy have a moral, if not a legal obligation to bring him to Australia?
Well, I think certainly moral. I mean, this is an absolutely heartbreaking story. It really is, and you could see that in the comments the Prime Minister made yesterday. Look, we'll look at whatever could be done there, Fran, but I think perhaps this may fall more into the territory of what people's moral responsibilities are here. I note that there was a comment earlier that the mother of this child, baby Gammy, wants the child to remain in Thailand, and that mother's wishes also has to be absolutely respected. But this whole issue, I think, is fraught with all of these sorts of difficulties, and I can understand the longing and anguish of parents in this situation who want to be parents, but equally there are some serious issues here that have to be managed very carefully.
And just finally, Minister, as a senior Cabinet Minister, is the government shelving plans for PPL? Have you put it on the go slow because you can't get the politics right on it?
No, that's not the case. I mean, the budget is the priority to get those measures through, and all of our other priorities then will be taken through the Parliament in an orderly fashion. The Prime Minister and the Treasurer remain very committed to this initiative, and they have the full support of their Cabinet.
Scott Morrison, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks very much, Fran.